Thank you all for joining us today for our fourth webinar in our series on pre-tenure series on the road to tenure. Again, these webinars are hosted by the Division for Research with the Council for Exceptional Children, and we are happy to have you here today to join us. So this webinar is on the tenure and promotion, and kind of the tenure committee will be our focus. I am Bree Jimenez. I am at the University of Texas at Arlington, and we have Sarah Powell, who will be your other kind of moderator for today at the University of Texas at Austin. And we are both with the Division for Research. The webinar series, like I said, is brought to you by DR. If you like this webinar, if you want to promote and help support similar programming, please consider making a donation to DR. You can use this tiny URL. You can also use our and join in and think about any donation, $1, $2, anything is helpful to help us support DR. But you don't have to make a donation. Of course, these webinars are free for our members and our friends. So if you're not a member already of DR, consider maybe joining DR. You can find more information through our website, which we'll post in the chat box, and other helpful resources. So today is our fourth in our series on the tenure committee, and we have some guests here and DR members, longtime DR members, to join us and talk about their journey along the way and as part of a tenure committee. If you've missed any of our previous webinars, as you can see here on the full 5 years research agenda or teaching and service, you can watch these. They are on our YouTube channel. Again, we'll post that in the chat. You can also find it at our website. And feel free to share them with others as well, or come back and look at them later. We do have the chat box open, and please consider, please join us with the chat and join us with our chat. We do like to keep this as interactive as possible. So, please type in there. We will moderate, and we will also, have opportunities for you to ask questions along the way. So please do join in, and we like to have this as interactive as possible. So first we'll start off, and we'd like to have our esteemed guests join us today and maybe introduce yourself. So we have Stephen Graham at Arizona State University. And Stephen, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself and this picture.
Okay, well, that's when I was a doctoral student at the University of Kansas. And my grandparents lived on the Oklahoma-Arkansas border. So this is at my grandfather's grandparents' place, which had no running water. Never had any running water the whole time they lived. I used to spend, if we were in the US, my father was in the Air Force, I would spend a month every summer picking berries on their small berry farm. And it just drove me crazy because you couldn't shower unless you couldn't bathe unless you did it outside. But this is Thanksgiving in 1977. I think I was 27 years old. Sarah said, give a picture of you in a relaxed mode. So I picked something really different. If you don't know, I'm at Arizona State University. I was at Vanderbilt for about 8 years, University of Maryland for 23, Purdue for 2, and Auburn University for 2. So I've been around the block, if you'd like. And I'm in about my 40th year in academia now. So been around a long time, hope to stick around at least a few more.
I love the hair.
Well, it kind of abandoned me. Hair has a way of doing that with men, unfortunately.
Now, you've told Sarah something just a little bit about yourself, and maybe it's with the academia of how long, but with the little symbol in the bottom, is that for how long you've been in academia?
I think if I'm looking at this, there's a symbol at the bottom. One of the things I'd mentioned to Sarah was that I was 9 years as an assistant professor, which is quite long. Most people are 4 or 5. But I moved to and then to Auburn on a soft money job, and then on a hard money job at Purdue. And then Karen and I moved, Karen Harris, who's my wife, moved to University of Maryland. And I took the full time, 5 years when I was at Maryland. So I actually didn't sweat going up from, from assistant to associate. I know sometimes we're in a real hurry, but I was slow getting out of the gate in terms of, getting to the point where I was doing the work that I would be most proud of and actually finding my rhythm. I did not come out of my doctoral program feeling I wouldn't have called myself a researcher. It took me about 4 or 5 years where I felt comfortable with that. And that's no knock on the doctoral program. It just was the way it was for me.
Great, thank you. Thanks for being here. And Betsy Talbott, would you like to tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so I am Betsy Talbott, and I am Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development and a Professor of Special Ed at William & Mary in Williamsburg, Virginia. I've only been here for 2 years, a year and a half, and I spent the bulk of my career at the University of Illinois at Chicago, so over 20 years at UIC in the big city, even though I'm from Appalachia, and I'm living in, small town, college town, Eastern Virginia. But I grew up in an urban serving, minority serving institution in the great city of Chicago. I had 3 little kids in 3 years, which was quite overwhelming. Here's one of them. He's not little anymore. His name is Will, and we're on the coast of Ireland. So that was a wonderful trip before the pandemic. In the little right-hand corner are my twins. One's happy and one's sad. They are in college now at the University of Iowa and at Indiana University. So Big Ten, big Midwest schools. So I like to think of, because I'm a developmental person and informs much of my research. So I like to think about your development as an adult, right? You're an adult developing, and you start out, you're a doc student, and you're mainly focused on research and learning how to, taking your own coursework, but also learning how to teach at the university level. You might reach a stage in your life where you have children and the demands that they place on your time, the little kids era. And then eventually, they grow up and leave. And that's, that's a good thing. You might get a puppy, which is what I did, but that's a good thing. And so your role as a researcher, as a faculty member, as a scholar, really is kind of entwined with the development of your life outside of work. So that's kind of my lens. And the other lens that I bring to this discussion is that I, of course, went through the tenure promotion track from, associate to full over the period of my career, but I've also been a department chair. I was a department chair forever at UIC. Probably too long. I should have been mentored, right? But for 10 years at UIC, I did it for 1 year at William & Mary, and now I'm an associate dean in charge of faculty development, which I love, and I'm going to talk about. So I look forward to talking with you about some ideas that I have for faculty development and your role as a new faculty member in your own development.
Thank you so much, Betsy. We also spoke with Kathleen Lane. She's not on the call, but we will hear about her journey and some of her tidbits as well. So really thinking about that tenure package, our 4 webinar series has kind of gone through this whole tenure to promotion, package for what all you're doing and how you're developing that over the many, many years, whether it be 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, longer. And really we're at that last point of really kind of going back to who and how do you decide about external reviewers, your external evaluators, the departmental recommendation, how that process works, P&T recommendations, the college recommendations. And so you've already done all this work and now you're here. And how does all this get put together? And what's the process look like? And what do we need to know about that to be successful and to set ourselves up for success?
All right, thank you so much, Bree, for that introduction. And Steve and Betsy, we're so glad you're here. We're going to go ahead and launch into our conversation for today. So as Bree said, we are focused today on tenure and promotion. So we're going to talk about letter writers. We're going to talk about how your tenure package is evaluated. And then what is that tenure and promotion process and what does that look like? And then we are going to save some time toward the end to talk about how we think COVID-19 will impact the considerations of promotion and tenure committees. This is uncharted territory for us. And so we're going to get some feedback from Steve and Betsy, but we'd also like the conversation to go among yourselves in the chat. So as we go today, please put questions in the chat and we'll answer them as we move along. So let's first talk about letter writers. Steve and Betsy, you have both probably written a lot of letters for people at other universities in terms of their tenure and promotion packages. And so I'd like to talk to you about how our people tuning in today, how they might select different letter writers, what choices they should make in terms of letter writers, and then how letter writers like yourselves evaluate their tenure packages. So first, let's talk about how are letter writers selected. And so Steve, anytime we see that little professor today, we're going to be thinking about you. And Betsy, anytime we see those twins today, we'll be thinking about you. So Steve, tell me a little bit about how letter writers are selected. And could you really comment on what do you mean by strong reputation?
Okay, so I want to start by saying, it's good to be a little nuanced in terms of this discussion because what may be looked at in terms of letter writers at a Research One institution may differ for institutions that place a heavier load, let's say, on teaching. So that's important to keep in mind. But typically, if we're thinking about a Research One, there's going to be a strong push for them to come from peer institutions. And so, if you're at the University of Illinois, somebody from another Big Ten school, or say from the University of Texas or University of Florida are going to be seen as peer institutions. Usually, particularly at Research Ones, they're going to be full professors. Occasionally, an associate professor will sneak in, but that's pretty unusual. Now, at a teaching institute, more heavily oriented teaching institution, that may shift. You may have associate professors if it's somebody going up from assistant to associate. The other thing here is that when I say peer institutions, depending upon the institution, not all of the letter writers have to come from a peer institution. You could have somebody, for example, I think a letter writer for me was Bernice Wong, who was at Simon Fraser. And my university didn't consider her to be a comparable university, but her reputation in the field of learning disabilities was stellar. And so this is the other part of this kind of formula, is that it needs to be somebody who has a strong track record for Research One in the area of research. And I would say, hopefully, it's somebody who knows the kind of research that you're doing. But, because we're in special education, we don't always have, like there's not 70 people out there at the full professor level doing exactly what we do. And so often you'll end up with one or two that are in your specific area, mine being writing, for example, and other people who are well known in special education, maybe more generally. So I think at this point, I'll leave it at that and give the floor to Betsy.
So thanks, Steve. I'm so glad that you brought this up about the nuance here. And I think that's something that we've seen throughout all of our webinars is that we're providing advice or this worked for this person or this worked for that person, but everybody does have to consider their individual case and their institution. Now, Betsy, one of the things that you told us about how letter writers are selected, so you, like Steve, said that most of the time they are full professors, but you said that your university or in some of the places that you've been, you invite people to review in the spring. So before a person actually submits their full tenure package. Can you comment a little bit on that? Because I think that's an important timing consideration that many of the people tuning in here today might want to think about.
Great. Yes, I'm happy to. Sarah, I'm revealing our secret. But because, as to Steve's point, there are only the pool of full professors at Research One institutions in the United States and beyond is only so large. So the strategy that we had at UIC was to begin to identify letter writers. They would be charged with writing the letter in the summer and turning it in by the end of the summer, but we would sort of line them up in the spring. We wouldn't send them any documentation in the spring. We would just basically secure their commitments. And that was fabulous because we were asking before anybody else. And so that was our secret.
And that's probably important because I would imagine a lot of full professors get a lot of asks at the same time of year, right?
Exactly. And it's a lot of work to write a really good letter, and you want to write you do basically you have to do a literature review. I'm jumping the gun probably here, but
No, that's
you have
fine.
to read the person's work and really understand it to write a good letter. And so you can only do so many of those in a given summer. So that was a secret that we had at UIC.
So at some universities, but not all, candidates can often suggest letter writers, maybe some of the letter writers or all of the letter writers. So if a candidate has that position to suggest letter writers, what are some of the things that they should consider? So Steve, if you were to suggest letter writers for yourself, like what would you consider in terms of putting together that list?
Well, I'd be really strategic on this. I laugh a little bit about this because I haven't had to do that in a long time.
Not for a while, right?
But I think one of the things, in some ways, this, kind of end point starts as soon as you come out of your doctoral school or before. You want to get to know people that are at the senior level doing work in your area particularly, because those are likely to be the folks that you're going to recommend. They're more likely to say, yes, I will do this if they know you and they know your work. It doesn't mean that they'll say no if they don't, but it just increases the likelihood because then they have a personal connection to you. Now, when you suggest letter writers, though, you can't suggest people that you've worked directly with. You can't have somebody who you've written an article with because they're not going to be seen as unbiased. And one of the questions that's often asked when you're a reviewer is, what is your connection to this person? Now, in small fields, we often have connections, over time with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're on safe grounds if the person says, well, I know them, but they're not like my next door neighbor and my best friend. And, we've written articles together, etc. So one of my letter writers as an assistant professor was Jim Eiseldike. Now, Jim and I don't do work in the same area, but he was a new editor of Exceptional Children. And I took the opportunity, I'd had something rejected really rather bluntly and fairly negatively by AC before he was the editor. And that used to be an in-house operation at CEC. And when he became the editor, I went to a session that he did. Honestly, I didn't really care what he was talking about that much. It wasn't of that much interest, but I found a way to talk to him afterwards and said how happy I was he was the new editor. And, I shared just 1 minute about my experience, but it established a connection between us. So he knew me when my stuff would pop up. I assumed that, he paid a little bit of attention to it. And so, I didn't recommend him as a letter writer, but the university picked him as one. And it was a good choice on my part, getting around and making connections. Now, hopefully I would have gotten tenure either way.
Yeah.
But I think there's a social side of this that needs to be really clear. Letter writers are more likely to write for people they know and they know something about.
You bring up a really good point about collegiality and really understanding and getting to know people in the field. Now, Betsy, one of the things that you said in terms of thinking about who might be a letter writer is talk to your senior colleagues. So who might be some people that would be good to talk to in terms of getting advice about letter writers?
So that's a good question. And I want to say that at UIC, we were not allowed to pick letter writers. So it was up to the person preparing your packet. And that person was, it was somebody designated. It was a full professor in the department designated to be your paper preparer. And that person gets the letter writer. So I was in that role for one of my colleagues. And so I went around and, I asked my senior colleagues in the field, who do you think would be a good letter writer? Our junior faculty you're not allowed to say, I really would like so-and-so to write my letter. They were not allowed to do that. They could say, list names of a couple of people who they shouldn't write, write letters to them. But you weren't allowed to write main names. So we're really dependent on our senior colleagues who were connected in the field of special education. And as Steve is saying, in your area and beyond in special ed, to name good people. So some people who are going to be, good letter writers in the sense of look at the whole candidate's research portfolio, provide a fair letter, not be sort of mean and nasty,
Well, because you've often read a lot of letters, right, from letter writers. And so sometimes you might have and a good understanding of this faculty member really writes nice, thoughtful letters, and this person may not spend as much time on it? Do you feel like that's some inside information that you might have?
Yeah, I would say the worst kind of letter is when somebody just reviews the person's vita. Thank you very much. I can count the number of publications. I can add up the grant money, right? That's completely useless. What you want is somebody who can talk about the work and its contribution to the field, which is challenging for letter writers when you get, so for example, if you get someone in, like me, I'm in the field of mental health and behavioral disorders. I had to review someone with expertise in autism. I had to do a lot of reading, but that's the kind of letter that's valuable. And you can talk about, the things that people, the conferences where people have presented, which is, where you get your name, one of the places where you get your name out there and you're known. And kind of piggybacking on what Steve said, I recommend the smaller conferences as well as the large ones. So PCRC and TECBD and I don't know all the acronyms, but the DAD conference, the smaller conferences where you're really going to get to meet
some people.
senior people in the field, I think is great for them getting to know you.
So we have two questions that have come in from the chat. So first, Sarah said, I have been told not to ask colleagues who I have been collaborated with in the past, but this is difficult when your research field is a true niche. So Betsy, could you give some advice to Sarah as to, maybe she focuses, you said you focus on mental health. You may not have 8 letter writers that are focused on mental health. What are some other possible types of letter writers you might ask to evaluate your tenure package?
And again, this is where I think the advice of your senior colleagues is really invaluable because they're going to be able to know people broadly in the field. So it could be, someone in the field of behavior disorders who has a different approach to the research than I have. But and you can also talk to your advisor, somebody you're close to who also knows the field. I mean, we're moving away from working closely with our advisors as new system professors. But when you talk to people are going to know the personalities and are going to have good suggestions. So we're in special ed. I can write a letter for someone in the field of autism, even though it's not my area. I have to be willing to do the work, to do the reading. But so if you're in a niche field, there are people who, in your BCBA person, there are people who can write those letters who might not be, that have that precise expertise.
Well, and you can think more broadly about the field of special education, have a few people that really understand your specific research, but then a lot of people in special education can evaluate that. Abby has a question, and Steve, I'm going to ask this question to you. Abby said, I'm required to submit a list of possible external reviewers. Should I also provide a list of people that the committee shouldn't ask because of a relationship with them? Maybe they are co-author, maybe a former advisor. Is that something that would be helpful? A list of don't ask these people, but ask these people?
Well, you can look at this 2 ways. One, if the committee's doing a good job, they're going to recognize who those people are. And if you have people who are ethical, who are your letter writers, they'll indicate that relationship before they write. However, with that said, it's not a bad strategy because it just makes it a little bit easier on the committee. Another thing I want to kind of point out that Betsy said, I think talking to your former advisor, all of our students do that with us when they're thinking about going up, because we've seen so many people write letters because we do 4 or 5 a year each. And you start to learn, you have some folks who are always positive. You have some folks that are always negative. And you can bet that I'm steering my former advisees away from somebody who's always negative. And so, it's just part of that process, so you have some people who you're not going to want to advise, to recommend as a letter writer because nobody's ever seen them write a positive letter. Now that's not very often, but you don't want to be on the losing end of that stick, so to speak.
Yeah, you want to have that inside information for sure. So let's see, I'm going to move ahead here. So as a letter writer yourself, how do you evaluate a candidate's package? So Betsy, you said you really look at the institution's guidelines. So could you talk us through what you receive from a university when you evaluate a candidate's tenure package?
Usually get a letter from the department chair, whoever's running the tenure process. And that person includes as a separate document the guidelines for tenure in that department where the faculty member is going up. And also in the letter from the department chair, the person or whomever, the person really explicitly says what they want you to do in your letter. And so I really attend to that. That's really important. It gets to Steve's point that sometimes the negative letter writers are people who sort of have an axe to grind, or they might have a perspective that, this is the standard, right? But really, the person is going up for tenure in a specific department in a specific university, and it's your responsibility as a letter writer to make sure you address all those points. So I'll use their guidelines as headings, and that's how I'll organize the letter. And then, as I mentioned, I'll read the work and I'll take notes. Steve builds a data summary table.
Oh, that's actually Kathleen builds a
Oh,
data
that's
summary
Kathleen.
table. Yeah.
That's
So,
I didn't
yeah.
look at
Sounds like
That's
Kathleen,
very
right?
valuable.
Very
For me, it's a little
organized.
bit more, it's like writing almost like writing a brief lit review.
Okay, interesting. And Steve, when you said you evaluate a candidate's package, you said that you're really looking for a consistent and meaningful line of research. And you also kind of said, I'm looking for maybe about 2 publications a year. So yeah, what are some of the things that you look for as a letter writer?
Yeah, so, I want to reiterate though what Betsy said is that I moderate this depending upon the institution. So
Mhm.
let's say that, your institution at University of Texas, I think probably the goal is 4 publications a year and, more first authorships.
Yeah.
I actually think that's maybe a little over the top. Um, but I have to take that into consideration,
Yeah.
because I know you're going to be evaluated on that. But typically, if I'm thinking about, just say the typical Research One institution, I'm looking for a couple of things. 1 or 2 consistent, some coherence in terms of what's being done. Now, one of the things that's important to say is that as the person who's being evaluated, when you put your material together, you want to make sure other people understand that coherence. If you leave it up to your reviewers to understand, you're taking a risk, quite honestly.
Mhm.
So when you present your research program in the material that you put together, the more coherent, the more connected, and the more important you can make the case for that research, the better. Because you can bet, not everybody does exactly what Betsy does. Not everybody will look as closely at your publications and all the stuff that you do. So take that out of play. You give them the best description you can of yourself. So one thing is that I look for is coherence. And I wouldn't be upset if there were 3 lines of research, as long as there's something that hangs together. You're moving forward in a positive way to advance our knowledge in a particular area. There's no magic number on number of publications. This is somebody a lot of people won't know, but I had a advisor once, not advisor of mine, but somebody who was at UCLA said, if you do 1 great paper a year for the rest of your life, you're going to have a hell of a career.
Mm.
And, I thought about that because there was always this do more, do more, do more, do more. And I thought about how many people have a really significant paper once a year in their life. And so I've kind of settled on 2, but they're papers that would be in, good journals for the field and would be impactful. They may not be seminal papers, but I think, if you have a career that looks like that, you probably have had a significant impact. If it's more than that, then that's gravy, so to speak.
Mhm.
I also look at this in terms of the university that you're at. If you're at a place, my first place, I taught 20 hours a week. So I taught 4 courses, 5 hours. You can't write as much. Your scholarship is not going to be the same as if you're at a place where you're teaching 6 hours a week.
Yeah.
And I also look at service load because I've seen plenty of situations where assistant professors have way more service than they should have. And then, they're in a sense penalized in the process for that. So I try to balance all of those things out in terms of teaching, service load, number and impact of publications, and a consistent volume. But it really does help. I want to reiterate that first point. Make sure you present to people who are reading your material a coherent program of scholarship.
You have to tell a really good story about yourself, don't you? All right, so now let's move on to the completed tenure package and what you see are some of the strengths and weaknesses for tenure packages. So, Steve, kind of a lot going along with what you just talked about is this establishing a meaningful line or several lines of research. Um, also talked about it's important they select articles that share their accomplishments in the best light. Like often people will select 5 articles that represent their body of research. Can you tell us a little bit about how we should think about selecting those articles?
Yeah, so you'll see one thing that I say there is as much as possible, they should be first authorship. And there's a couple of considerations here. So um, I'm going to take my wife's, some of her students, some of Karen Harris's students. They often are interested in doing self-regulated strategy development research when they leave. But in one way of thinking about this is they need to get some distance between Karen or I in terms of their own work. It is not to their advantage to continue to have us as authors on the work that they do, because then reviewers have trouble separating what's their work and kind of what's our ideas. And so, you know, a couple of ways of thinking about this in terms of picking articles. One, you want articles that kind of represent the very best of what you do. Second, if you're first author on those articles, it's not going to raise an issue in reviewers' minds about who led this work.
Mm-hmm.
And third, I would not put forward 3 articles where my former advisor was on that, at one at the most. And that would be earlier in the sequence, you know, within a year or 2 after coming out of doctoral school. You know, if you have, if you have a research program that kind of represents a diversity of the kinds of work you do. Now, that it's not a problem if you don't. If you're a qualitative worker and you do a particular approach and you use this consistently, that's fine. But let's say you're a quantitative researcher and you do work that involves modeling, using something like structural equation modeling or something else. You do intervention research, you do single case research. You might present your best examples of each of those to show, assuming that they're very strong pieces, kind of your flexibility and your skills across different kinds of things. That last point here, though, is a little bit more iffy. If I had to pick, I'd still pick your best work that you're first author on.
Great. Thanks for that advice, Steve. Now, Betsy, you talked about that you look at signature, impact, and trajectory. So could you just comment a little bit on what you're looking for a really strong tenure package?
First of all, I want to echo everything Steve just said. For the record. But yeah, and the tenure reviewers, and this was the UIC criteria, and I really, really like these criteria because I think they're really extremely helpful for candidates. So we talked about, and Steve mentioned he was looking for a coherent program of research. That comes out in the candidate's research statement, right? You send a research statement out as part of your packet. And then the letter writer gets to be the translator for the field. So if I'm, translating the work of someone in the field of autism, then I'm able to write a letter that communicates to the neuroscientist on the university committee or the medical school professor who's going to be evaluating your packet. So that's something to keep in mind. And that's why telling your story and working on telling your story now, even though you aren't up for tenure yet, is a really good activity to kind of as that evolves. So I just kind of want to throw that out there. And with regard to these 3 criteria that UIC established, I really love these because they also evolve throughout your career. But your signature, what do you want to be known for? Now you're a new faculty member, so you're being known for some things, but that's back to your coherent statement that Steve has been talking about. So this is my signature. This is what I want to be known for. And then your impact. What I like about this is that it doesn't just have to be impact factor, and it can also reflect, and should, especially in special ed, the impact of your work for researchers, obviously, but also for practitioners, for people in the community. What is your impact for policymakers? What is your impact broadly defined? And that's been really helpful to our candidates to think about that. And finally, to your trajectory, because this is something that a lot of times letter writers are asked to comment on. Where do they see you heading in the field? That's such, do you have this promise of a scholar? We want you to be tenured because we know that you're going to contribute to the field for at least 40 years, right, Steve? And so the strong package will show evidence of these three things, independent, as Steve pointed out, of your advisor and other collaborators.
Thanks, Betsy. Now, on the opposite side of that, we just talked about, what might be some weaknesses of a tenure package. So, Steve, you talked about failure to make a case for why their scholarship is important. Could you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, so this is sometimes a challenge when you're just starting out. Okay, so you come out of a doctoral program, you most likely have your dissertation, maybe some other publications. And now all of a sudden you're more on your own. You're not probably completely disconnected from former collaborators and, people you went to school with and your advisor, but you have to put your own research program together. And it's in a relatively short period of time. I mean, in some ways, having 9 years to get to tenure, you can put together a pretty good coherent body of work without having, and you can have some lapses and errors along the way, so to speak. But with 5 years, you don't have that. And so, you may try one kind of piece of work in an area and you decide not to follow that line and something else somewhere else. And so what it's incumbent upon you to do as a letter writer, as much of that work, it's great if all of your work is consistent and headed in the same path. But my experience with assistant professors is that there's some scattershot in there.
Mm.
There's some things that are right going down a specific line or a second line, and then there's scattershot. So part of what you have to do as a letter writer is you have to bring as much of that together. Sometimes you have to be creative. It's got to be logical and it's got to be believable, but you have to look for ways of bringing those disparate pieces together when you can. Now, you don't want to make a case here if you've got something that really sets way out there. You don't want to try to say it's part of this line. You can say this is something that I initially looked at as an area of research I might pursue and decided not to do that. I know that's usually not something that most letter writers say, but I actually appreciate it when I see that because it gives me a sense of your overall trajectory, what you're doing, how things connect together. So as much as you can in terms of bringing that together, please do. The other part of this is remember, and I'll give myself an example. When I started, there was virtually no one doing research on writing with kids with special needs. I mean, I could probably count one other person, and Karen would be the third person. And so we weren't going to have reviewers who were looking at writing. So we had to make our case very clear to them. And so, one of the things Betsy talked about a little bit before is on the choosing of who's going to write your letters. So one of the things we had to think about in terms of recommendations is we look for people in literacy because at least they would understand writing, or we look for people who did instructional research because that's where we were focusing our efforts. So I know I jumped off a little bit on that. I wanted to circle back around to that because that's sometimes, that's a real challenge sometimes if there's very few people doing what you do.
Well, and kind of a little earlier, one of the things you made me think about, Steve, was how important it is to really understand who you are as a researcher early on in your tenure process. And that's not just in your last year before going up for tenure, but it's really in your first year in your tenure track job so that you can focus on who you are and what you want to do and say no to some of these things that might draw you in many different directions. Because if you want to be focused on one or two lines of research, you have to really understand what you want to do and how you want to get there. Now, Betsy, yeah, go ahead.
So you made me think of something, and then I'll be quiet on this.
Oh, no, you're fine.
I call this the lure of easy data.
Yeah.
And that is when somebody offers you something. It's almost like it's too good to be true. They offer you something, you don't have to go out and collect the data, but it's not what you do. And it takes you out. It's easy because it's there.
Yeah.
You can write about it. You can do something, but it's not what you do. It's not who you are. And it takes you away from the things that, you typically say to other people you most want to do.
Yeah,
So
you really have to evaluate how you want to spend your very precious time, right?
yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly right. So
Now,
thank you.
Betsy, one of the things you mentioned in your comment was thinking about different types of publications. And I know this is something that I was faced with when I was in my tenure track before I received tenure. And that's, should I take that book chapter? Should I write that handbook chapter? Or should I submit to a peer-reviewed journal? So can you comment a little bit on that decision that some people may have to make?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think actually, I really do think that a well-placed chapter is good to have as part of your
Yeah.
portfolio. It's really nice. I think what people can fall into the trap on is these, if it looks too good to be true, it probably is opportunities where you get emails that are,
Oh,
submit your paper to this new online journal and you can get it published in really quick turnaround. It's not really peer reviewed. I mean, you might have some people read it who are scholars in the field, but they're more editing it. And those do not look good as
yeah.
part of your portfolio. And yet, as we know, it takes so long to get your paper through the publication process, especially during COVID, because more people are submitting, and journals, have a lot in the pipeline. So I would just really encourage people to stay the hell away from those offers. I mean, a well-placed.
If you haven't heard of the journal, you should probably not submit to that journal. I think that's probably pretty good advice there, right?
Ask your advisor
Yeah.
before you say yes.
All right, so let's move on to what is the process for tenure review. So let's talk about the review, why people may receive or deny tenure, and then we'll go into I can't even read it on the slide. We'll talk about the end part of the process. So Steve, can you talk to us a little bit about the process at your institution? And you talked about 7 levels of review. I think that that's true in a lot of places, but that may shock a lot of people that are tuning into this webinar. So can you talk a little bit about those different levels of review?
Yeah, and I need to mention ASU is a little different
Okay.
because we don't have departments.
Yeah.
So it's a weirdness that I'd never experienced before until coming here. We have divisions, 2 divisions. And so there's, 100 people in your division. So you don't have a department review, you have a division review. So I'm going to not use that part of this, but a more traditional part.
Okay.
And so what typically happens is there's a committee that, that's put forward. They often, but not always, ask you to select people that you'll put forward, and then they'll select people as well. And at my institution right now, we aim for 10 letter writers, which seems insane to me. Most places don't do quite that many, but we're actually aiming for 10 people to write letters.
Wow.
The letters come back and, along with your portfolio, which will include, your write-up about your research, your service, your teaching, your articles that you put in there. Generally, you have this box. It's moved more to electronic now, but in my early days, I used to have this box that followed me around everywhere I went. And, basically you have 3 or 4 or maybe more people on a committee who review your materials. And hopefully they're taking into account your, what your institution requires. They look independently at your materials. They look at the letters that come in, and then they make a recommendation. And in some institutions, but not all, if you're in a department, the department will also vote. And so then that information then may go to the department head. In my place, it goes to the division head, and then goes, and there's a letter written there with an independent review based in part on what the committee's recommended. And then it goes to the dean, and the same thing happens there. And then it works its way through the university with the eventual endpoint being the university president. Now, you're usually feeling really good if you get out of the committee and out of your department. That's usually a really, really good sign. But there can be trip ups.
Don't celebrate yet, right?
Right. Occasionally there are trip ups at levels beyond. The other thing I should say, there are sometimes cases where a committee doesn't recommend you, and a dean will overturn that. That takes a little bit of their oomph, so to speak, out of what they can do over time down the line in the university structure. because that's not something universities typically like, is where a department level analysis is overcome in a different direction
Mm-hmm.
at the college level with the dean, but it doesn't occasionally happen. So that's important to realize, is it's not always lockstep, but feel good if you've gotten out of that department level
Yeah.
process.
Very good advice. Very good advice. Now, Betsy, one of the things that you talked about in terms of the review process, and this is maybe not exactly about the review process, but you really talked about like third year review. So could you comment a little bit on like third year review and how important that is for setting you up for going up for tenure?
So that's a great question, Sarah. And in a minute, I'm going to get up on my soapbox here. As you can tell, I have a soapbox about faculty mentoring. The third year review happens in your third year, and it really is designed to mimic the promotion and tenure process without getting the outside letter. So you submit all your materials, including your teaching evaluations and so on, and you get feedback. At UIC, the feedback was at the department level and through the dean. So the third year review doesn't go outside of the college or the school of education. So if you think about it, as y'all have pointed out, the tenure process is a really short one, and things take a long time to get published, and it's hard to get grant funding, even if you're a senior faculty member. So there's a lot of pressure. So a lot of institutions will have annual reviews. You have an annual review where you get feedback, and sometimes that's too long. So at UIC, we develop these committees, and I also develop them in my role as a faculty development at William & Mary, the mentoring committees, which are designed to provide formative feedback and meet with the candidate once a semester. This is evaluative in the sense that we're helping support you to get promoted. We're not writing something up, other than to say we went through this process and here's how it went. And those committees have been invaluable because they do give frequent feedback. They do things like and it has the advantage of the committee. It's almost like, a little focus group where people bounce ideas off each other and say, oh, you know about that journal, or you really should send your work here, or I can connect you with a colleague in the field. So there's that networking piece. So some of the things we hear about on Twitter and other places is that, maybe the moms with the 3 little kids are missing out on some of the networking opportunities, or some faculty of color might not have those same opportunities. The mentoring committee is a systematic way of creating those opportunities. And we've just found it to be really effective, and also steering people away from things that are likely to be less productive for their careers.
So Betsy, I think a lot of people may reach out to you to inquire more about that mentoring process. It just sounds so important and so amazing here. So I'm going to kind of just very quickly just kind of show these quotes because I think we already talked to them about why do people receive tenure. I think that you can see kind of the same themes emphasized in terms of what we talked about with the letter writers, as well as maybe why might people be denied tenure. So I'll just pause there. We won't dig deep into these because I do want to launch into a little bit of a conversation related to COVID-19 and how that may change the tenure evaluation for some people. But before we do that, what advice would you share with candidates? Steve, you said something that I think is so important. So I'd like you to emphasize it again, but tenure starts when?
Right when you start. It really starts when you're working on your dissertation, if you want to be frank about it. And I'll just really briefly give you an example. My dissertation was in the area of reading. When I was done with it, I realized that wasn't my area of interest. And so in some ways, my move towards tenure started right at that point where I decided I was more interested in writing than I was in reading. And I had to start, gearing up for that. But you want to be forward focused and think about, a lot of the things we said, what it is that you want to do, what your signature is, as Betsy said, and how you're going to achieve your goals. So that starts at day one.
Can't start planning too early, can you? And then Betsy, you also said about mentorship. So if a university doesn't have this really cool mentorship committee that you're talking about, you said ask for a mentor. So what are some of the ways that you would suggest our viewers to go about finding a mentor that could really help them along the tenure process?
Your department chair is usually your main contact with the department, and that person should be able to help you connect with potential mentors, ideally more than one. I mean, you don't want two, multiple people giving you different advice. You want to be, there's some kind of coherent recommendations, but I think that your department chair is your first line of contact regarding mentors. And one of the things we haven't talked about is, and then of course it's so important, is the value of your colleagues in the field, your pals who are going through this at the same time, both at your institution and at other institutions, and ways you can support each other and maybe collaborate on papers together and, get each other through this. So there's that mentorship, which is, of your buddies, right?
Yeah, find your cohort, right? You have your doctoral level cohort, but find your tenure track cohort of people that are doing the same thing that you are at the same time. I think that's great advice.
So important.
Yeah, so today we talked about letter writers, we talked about, your completed tenure package, and we talked about the tenure process. Right now, I want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. So Betsy, I'll start with you. So how do you think that tenure expectations may have changed due to COVID-19? And like, how should candidates think about this, especially if they're a year or two away from going up for tenure?
So this is, uncharted territory for everybody, and everybody includes those deans and department chairs who are supporting you and ultimately part of your evaluation process. So I think that it's really important when you come into the new institution that you have really clear expectations about whether things have changed, or I think a lot of institutions are moving towards providing additional support, which they should do in my mind, for junior faculty because of COVID. So maybe you get an additional course release, maybe you get, some kind of release from service so that you have more time to do your research. It's very hard to get into schools right now, at least for many of us, because school professionals are dealing with so much, right? And so that can kind of slow things down. So I think it's just really important for those expectations to be clear. One of the things I think we need to see is statements going out as to the letter writers to say things like, if the person takes an extra year, this cannot be held against them. Everyone's granted an extra year at our school. So wow. I think those kinds of things are definitely being worked out at the dean level. But I also think for candidates, for y'all, it's being really, really creative and talking to your colleagues and coming up with creative ways to do research. If you have really applied research that requires working with people in schools, can you do some work online? Can you do some research online? What are some, can you work with existing data until schools, get up and running face-to-face again? So I think that there's a lot of creative ways. I think if I was coming in at this time, I would really work on those creative opportunities and get as much training as possible and how to do research online, for example. There's some good webinars out there. So those are the kinds of things I would do as a candidate. And then and from the administrative side, there's got to be that support and explicit attention to this many stresses associated with COVID.
For sure. Now, Steve, how do you think tenure expectations may have changed due to COVID-19?
Well, so I think one of the things, I want to echo what Betsy said. You want to check and see what kind of breaks your institution is providing you. If they're offering an extra year, and this has seriously influenced what you were able to do, I would take it. I wouldn't hesitate about it. And I think, people who review tenure packages, they're experiencing the same issues that you are. Everybody right now's research programs, particularly in an area like special education, where we're both so focused on providing interventions, everybody's feeling this. So I think that letter reviewers are going to be, sensitive to that. And I think that probably should be reflected, as Betsy said, in the letters that go out from the university, and could be reflected in some degree without kind of, pushing the blame fully on COVID, but explaining, shifts that you made in your program due to COVID. So that may make the letter writer much more sensitive. So
if you put that information in your research statement saying, hey, we were doing this, but then this happened.
Another thing that I want to mention, and I think this is important. So, if you ask me what kind of researcher I am, I'd probably say an intervention researcher. But I would say only 1 out of 3 things that I publish are intervention oriented. So when we design a study, we always design the pretest data we collect so that we can look at something of interest to us from a correlational point of view in terms of writing. So we may have motivation measures that we want to know what their relationship is to writing performance, or we may want to, trial out a new measure that we can do in another study. And so when, kind of these disasters happen like this, we may have data that still fits within our line of research that we can take advantage of. And the last thing I would say on this, I didn't plan this, but we actually have a study that we have submitted now, taking a look at the effects of COVID with first grade kids writing in Norway, of all places.
Wow.
They had about a 6-week lockdown, and I'm doing some work with them. And we collected data before. And then when they came back, we thought, why don't we take a look and see what happens? Because we now have 2 cohorts of first graders in the same schools. And so there may be some opportunities to do something of interest to see what happens when schools shut down like this and go online, because Norway went completely online. And,
Yeah.
so, it provided an avenue that we hadn't thought about initially.
Interesting. I can't wait to read that study. All right, a question has come in. Tracy said, in considering taking an extra year, how would you balance this if you only have 1 year left on your tenure clock? She said, our data collection has slowed down, but I worry that COVID may not show up on her, kind of like, on until she goes up for tenure. So I know, Betsy, you already started to answer this, but could you elaborate a little bit upon Tracy's question? Or I may have lost Betsy for a a bit. I think she
I
was
think
answering.
Sorry.
There you
You
go,
know what?
Betsy.
I'm gonna blame that on COVID.
Yeah, go for it.
Unmuting myself. Okay, so what was I saying? Oh yeah, it's your tenure case. You are making a case for your promotion and tenure, and that's what the packet is all about. So you want to look at your case and what your signature, impact, and trajectory look like. If everything looks good and you're in a strong position, and here's where you talk to your senior colleagues and you talk to your close advisors and so on, and you might want to just go for it. You might not want to wait because it seems like the COVID effect might be later. So I really do think it comes down to individual cases.
Yeah, and a lot of communication. Talk to your department chair, talk to your dean, talk to former mentors. Like, it's really important to get that advice. All right, Jihoon asks, I'm going to ask Steve this question. Steve, how do you balance between the quality of publications and the quantity of publications? Do external reviewers usually consider both aspects?
Well, so there's, you have to have a certain level of quantity before people are going to consider that you have quality. And I'm probably the worst person to ask about this, because I think I started off with quantity in my mind and not quality. It took me a while to come around to that. But I would say, I would go back to what I said earlier. If you have something that's well done and in a really good journal, it's worth 3 or 4 or 5 of things that are poorly done and in journals of less stature. So let me give an example of this. I reviewed somebody recently, a couple of different people, and not in special ed, because I've been an editor of journals outside of special ed. I often get asked to review people either in literacy generally or in ed psych. And this was in literacy, and they had no article. They had a lot of articles, but they didn't have a single article in Reading Research Quarterly, the NRC's journal, or SSR's, journal. So in no single paper were they published in what I would call a highly visible venue. And, that immediately raised a red flag. I would have liked to have seen at least one of those. And so I think if you publish in a strong journal, or in strong journals, the number of publications is less of a problem. And if your focus is on number of publications, it's probably problematic over time, because you're not thinking about the quality of what you do and the impact of what you do. You're just churning stuff out. And, again, I want to reiterate, that's the way I started my career, and it was a mistake.
Yeah. Thanks so much for that answer, Steve. That was very thoughtful. Abby will be our last question for today. Abby asks, I'm getting mixed messages at my university regarding first author pubs. Would it be worth taking an entire extra year to get a few more first author pubs because the publication pipeline has been slow due to COVID? Betsy, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so I was going back to Steve's general guideline of seeking, aiming for about 2 pubs a year. So kind of look at the papers you have out so far and those you have in the pipeline, try to anticipate how long it might take to get those published. And then regarding the mixed messages thing, this also really bugs me when I hear this kind of thing. It's very, very common. I mean, I would push your chair and your dean to give you the message, right?
Yeah.
Look, I'm getting mixed messages here. What's the message? Because you need to know if you're in the process of making that decision about waiting. Here's my vita. What do you think? That's really important for them to tell you.
Great. All right, well, we're going to wrap up because it is the top of the hour wherever you are. Just a reminder, if you have missed any of our previous webinars about the road to tenure, they are on the DR YouTube channel, and this will be posted probably by Monday or Tuesday of next week. And if you are thinking past tenure, we would like you to join Jessica Tost and Emily Solari starting April 9th for our webinar series called The Associate's Life. So what happens post tenure? I love how Jessica says, now what? And how do you focus on your research agenda? And how do you take that road to full? So you can register and join Jessica and Emily. I'm really excited to tune into this. I think it'll be really exciting. And for some of you who are thinking about associate life, even if you don't have tenure, anyone is welcome to join in. So a very nice thank you to Betsy Talbott and Steve Graham for joining us today. I think your advice was invaluable. So thank you so much for joining us. And we thank all of you for tuning into this DR webinar.